a little bit of a quick background on this project. So a couple of years ago, when Jim Hubbard was still in front of state and private forestry, he basically went to the folks he deals with in NASF and said, I need better measures and better ways to tell the stories about the value of state and private forestry. He said, I'm always in front of OMB and appropriation staff and other constituents, and there's federal dollars and there's state dollars and there's federal problems and state problems, and we need to be in a really, really strong position to explain, what state and private forestry brings in terms of value to the people in the country and even to the Forest Service, the big Forest Service, National Forest Service, and how we help and partner. And so he wanted to come up with compelling, quantifiable, and nationally consistent measures for sort of explaining the value across all the program areas. So there's sort of a fair amount of water under the bridge, and I know that some folks have probably seen some of this and some probably less, but basically what our team did was we were contracted to work on this project, and so we had a lot of stakeholder engagement. We interviewed a lot of people. We did a fair amount of surveys, and we came up with a list of candidate measures, and we worked with the regional groups, meaning the Southern Group, the Western Forestry Leadership Group, and the NASF group, so the Northeast group, and some of the members there, and we worked on the regional meetings to help sort of get that list down from 18, which is pretty big number of measures to pull off. We got it dropped down to 6 measures to start with, and then in 2016, basically all the state foresters put the language to a motion that they said, yes, we agree with these 6 measures. We agree that we're going to work as a collective of states, and we're going to work to provide the data, the input, and the help to get these things pulled off, and we believe it's a good idea to be in a more proactive position versus a defensive position. So one of the things that we did was at the beginning of the project, when you're working on performance measures, it's extremely important to sort of understand like who you're talking to. So, if I'm trying to convince my kids of something versus my mom versus OMB or appropriation staff, you have to use a different vernacular. You have to understand what motivates them, what they care about. And so we spent a fair amount of time up front saying, okay, who's really the audience for these measures? So, of course, we had a huge, list of candidate, audience members, but at the top was really appropriation staff, Congress members, and then to a lesser degree, OMB gets circled around there to a degree, but appropriation staff is really the people that we're trying to convince. The other thing that's really important is that these are not measures for any individual state. So people have a hard time remembering that we're trying to convince OMB and appropriation staff, and they have a hard time remembering that it's not about the specific problems in any given state, because those vary greatly across the country. We're trying to come up with a national story. So we said, okay, we interviewed appropriation staff, and we worked with them, and we said, what's really on your mind right now, and what's most concerning to you? And so and we surveyed all of the people and said, what do you think is going to move the needle with appropriation staff? And pretty much what we heard is clean water was probably the biggest thing we heard, and wildfire. So fire and water were really the big themes. So originally we had this list to just fire and water, and then we got a lot of pressure from sort of the Midwest and even some of the southern states that we really need to get jobs in there. And I sort of lobbied against telling stories about jobs and economic benefits, simply because unemployment's like at 4%. I said, I think you're going to lose that battle when you start getting in the mix with jobs and IT jobs and, biotech and all these really sort of high paying jobs and volumes of jobs. I said, but what I can get behind is, in this administration, let's talk about rural jobs. Let's talk about, things we can do that are sustainable in rural America, make America great again, sort of all that kind of theme of thinking. I said, because I think we can potentially come up with a good story there, and you know, I'm glad that we ended up putting it in there, because I think we ended up in a really good position on that one. And just interrupt me. I have a sort of bad habit of just sort of rolling on, so just be aggressive if you need me to stop, and it's not going to bother me. So these are the 6 measures that we came up with. There's a number that goes to the left, which we went through and did sort of a complexity score on these. So this is, you know, do we think we have the data to pull it off? If we do have the data, how hard is it going to be to calculate the measures and sustain them? So the higher numbers represents the ones that are harder to pull off, and then the lower numbers are ones that were at the beginning of this theoretically easier to pull off. But we weren't really sure yet. So these are the 6 measures that went through, and you'll notice that there's a couple for fire, a couple for water, and a couple for economics and jobs. So once we came up with the measures, we got everybody sort of on board that, yep, we're going to go forward, we're going to work to do these. Then we had to do the hard work of, now we were down to 18 to 6 of saying, okay, actually, how are we going to pull this off? Like mechanically, you know, what data do we need and what calculations do we need to crank these things out? So we took those 6 and we've broken them into 2 waves. So we're pretty far along with wave 1, and then we split up and we're doing wave 2 now. So we've started working on sort of the wave 2 measures, and I'll go through these in a little bit of detail. So this is kind of the status of where we are. So we actually said, hey, the only way we can prove that we can pull these off nationally is to do pilots with them. So, you know, we've completed pilots for a bunch of them, and we're pretty far along in manually calculating. And, you know, again, we're trying to do this across all, you know, 50 states, islands, and all these, and it's a bit of a tough task. So we have these stories that we worked up, and so this is one that we came up with. Sort of, it's a water theme, and we wanted to try to wiggle one in around urban and community forestry. To be honest, the urban folks, I would say not all of them, but a fair amount of them aren't super happy with this story, but we have been struggling to come up with something that they like better. So this has been a little bit of a problematic one. So I'll just kind of go through. We worked up these storyboards for every measure, because it's really sort of hard to explain these stories without stair-stepping people through them. So I'll kind of walk through this storyboard a little bit. So we know green infrastructure helps communities to protect, restore, and mimic natural water cycle by allowing more water to infiltrate into the ground and less stormwater to run off. We know that a community's capacity to implement green infrastructure projects depends on its awareness, its technical knowledge, its grassroots buy-in, priorities, and partnerships. And we know that states provide technical assistance to help communities build this capacity to implement stormwater mitigation, green infrastructure projects. So in a lot of cases, urban and community forestry, they're not actually on the ground in the cities and towns implementing the projects, but what they're doing is they're enabling that through funding, through technical assistance, through guidance, and some other things. So we have this common sort of way that we like to tell stories, and the way we like to tell stories is, you know, we're going to look at the face of the earth, and because we're land management organizations, we're going to figure out a way to prioritize where we should be doing work on the ground. Then we're going to prove that we've actually done something on the ground. We're going to prove that we've done something on the ground, and then ultimately what we want to do is show some sort of alignment with where we have priorities on the ground, or some sort of, ideally, some sort of impact or outcome. So this is kind of a common way that we're trying to tell stories. And so in this case, we want to look for communities that basically have a lot of pavement, right? So we want to target, you know, communities that are willing to accept help and they're ready for help, and they have a lot of pavement, where we believe we can get out there and put trees and help mitigate stormwater, you know, impacts and the damage that happens from stormwater runoff and all the other things associated with it. So we want to do the work and provide assistance, and then we want to show that some of this green infrastructure delivery impacts people of those target communities, and that we have a good alignment with that. So these are the types of things that state and private provides to urban and community forestry. So they grant them, they give technical assistance, they coordinate with them, they do a lot of planning activities, and these are some of the types of things that they actually do. So erosion control structures, green roofs, you know, the kind of lead design stuff that you're seeing out there now. Ultimately, the holy grail is we would like to help them get to the point where they actually put some sort of regulation or ordinance in place in these areas that have the high potential to have an impact by doing stormwater mitigation and better overall planning and ordinances, and that's what we want to do. So then what we did is we had a bunch of SMEs on there, so Idaho, Alaska, in the south we had Georgia and Texas, and what we did is we had them work with us on doing some pilots. And so we have this story of, you know, how well did we invest our dollars in terms of we hit 42% of the target communities, and that we impacted 21.8 million people by delivering technical assistance to those communities. So we've got target communities. We did a pretty good job of lining up our work with them, and we have a big impact. So any questions on that before I go through? All good? Okay. So states also get VFA dollars. So every state in the country gets volunteer fire assistance dollars, and it's supposed to be targeted towards relatively low population, sort of rural fire departments, and it's supposed to be targeted towards wildfire response and building the capacity to jump on and do initial attack on a wildfire. And that's really sort of the theme of those dollars. So we want to make sure that we're only giving it out to sort of the rural localities, and then B, that they actually have some sort of wildfire risk. So again, here's our sort of story around this one. So it's critical that local fire departments in higher risk areas for wildfire have the training, equipment, and capacity to be efficient and effective in initial attack around wildfires. Fire departments whose response areas covers more wildfire threat are going to have a greater need and capacity to contain wildfires quickly. So in this case, you're looking at Fire Department A and Fire Department B, and then because you folks are probably familiar with the Southern Wildfire Risk Assessment, you could envision that. I think this is actually the West, but you can look at that, and the reason those pixels are red is because A, something on the ground will burn, and B, because there's something there we care about. So there's some assets at risk. So, you know, the landscape is not equal, and we want to understand sort of the response area for Fire Department A and the response area for Fire Department B. Then what we want to do is we want to make sure that, you know, we're using that as part of our equation, because if Fire Department A absolutely had no risk for wildfire, even though they might be in a rural economy, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to be prioritizing those dollars for wildfire suppression. We want to make sure that we're allocating dollars smartly, and Fire Department B probably needs a little bit more help because there's things that'll burn and there's things we care about there. So this is a good example of when we don't have those response areas, so if we don't know exactly where that fire department has response capacity or response authority, we have to go up and come up with these really sort of creative ways to figure out where that fire department responds. So what we do is we go into these existing databases, we pull out this fire department ID. So that's actually a sort of a GPS or a geocoded based on address location of that fire department. Then we run into INFRS, which is another database which has unfortunately very poor data. But we try to pull out every one of those blue dots, which is actually where that fire department responded to incidents. So those could be structural fires or wildfires. Then we use GIS to create this quote-unquote proxy response area for that fire department because it's simply the best thing we have. Then what we do is we put this burn probability or this risk map behind it, and we take that polygon and we give it a score. So ultimately what we're trying to do is get every one of these response areas either real if we can get it, or we're going to make it up if we can't based on sort of the crummy data we have, and then we're going to score it. So on the left, in Minnesota, you can see where we had to use fake boundaries. And then on the right, we're showing where they actually gave us the real boundaries. And you can see there's a pretty big disparity in the quality of the data. But, you know, we have to do the best with what we can. And, you know, we need some way to move the needle forward. And hopefully it's going to incentivize people to, you know, get us better data. Then what we want to do is we want to say, okay, now we know where these boundaries are. We're going to give them a score, and we're going to understand how much money each one of those got, or received, rather. And we're trying to correlate and say, hey, these folks who are in high and medium risk areas, you're actually funding them appropriately and giving them a little more money, you know, and ideally we have the GIS data to pull that off. So this is kind of where we are with this one, and I think most of it's not your responsibility to chase them down, it's mine, but we're pretty good in the South. Got a few outliers, but not too bad. The key to this one is it's painful and manual. So here's an example where it's a lot less painful and a lot less manual because we've been doing a really good job of getting data into SMART, which is a stewardship mapping and reporting tool that the Fed's run, and it's got some good data that we were able to lean on. So this is some of our economics and our job stories, so and how state and private forestry helps in that situation. So this is our story. So counties that have productive timber markets, so basically there's data out there that shows how much wood is hitting the mills and what counties that's coming from. So we have good what's called TPO data to help us understand that, and we want to know where those are. Then what we want to do is we want to make sure that when we put stewardship foresters out on the ground, they're actually targeting those areas where we know a viable economy exists and a viable market exists for logging. And we want to make sure that those stewardship foresters are engaging people both before they log and do management of their land and making sure they're doing good, proper management up front. And then also post-harvest, we want to make sure they're doing good regeneration and, you know, replanting and all the things that we want to do. And we want to do that so that we can ensure that industry, meaning logging, is sustained, that the jobs that it produces are sustained, and that wages are supported. And again, it's kind of a rural America. It's a sustainment of an industry and the creation and sustainment of jobs around, and using state and private stewardship foresters to make that happen. So our story goes that forestry jobs produce or consume timber, that produce or consume timber are vital to local economy, including jobs in forestry, sawmills, paper mills, pulp, wood factories, etc. Forest resources are sustained and healthy and productive when forest landowners get sound forest management guidance up front post logging. S&PS invests in management, planning, technical assistance, and education for landowners so that they will implement sound forest management practices. And if we look at the study from 2016, we have a good feeling that that folks, individual landowners, are more likely to meet their management objectives, you know, 2.5 to 3 times more, and more likely to reforest if they actually have had some sort of technical consultation and technical guidance. So, you know, and this is a program, you know, the forest management and stewardship program, it's constantly under scrutiny from OMB and appropriation staff, and they're constantly in the mode of saying, you know, you wrote 10,000 plans or 1,000 plans, you know, so what? What does that mean? You know, we don't know whether you implemented anything. We don't know what you did. So, you know, the whole stewardship program is under a kind of a redesign right now. They're trying to look for better and more compelling ways. And, you know, for us, I think we got, you know, relatively smart and relatively lucky coming up with this one that I think is really timely, and it's already helping to sell the value of that program. So what we did is this little chart here just shows one sort of relative example, but what this shows is an alignment between where stewardship plans are being done in terms of the counties where your stewardship foresters are out on the ground, and how well that lines up with where we are seeing the timber come off the ground. So if you have a really good alignment with where wood is moving off of the land in terms of the counties and where you're doing stewardship, we see this correlation very well across the whole country, which leads us to believe that we're doing good stewardship, we're engaging private landowners, and they're helping to move that economy forward. So we target our technical assistance and planning investments to counties with productive timber markets, and this just kind of shows that we have a way to figure out which counties are moving wood, and then we have a way to target those localities and provide technical assistance to landowners. The reason we do that is because we want to contribute and help ensure that there are quality jobs and income for millions of people across the country. And so here's the data we've worked up. The key is that we use this from Bureau of Labor Statistics, FIA and TPO, and SMART, so we didn't have to ask for any new data because all of the folks who are in the forest management side of the house, they've been doing the hard work to get the data into SMART, and we've got a much more compelling story than we funded 100,000 plans. So this is much better, and we used existing data, and this is the model for all these measures we'd like to pull off. Any questions on that one?
Yeah, Lowell, this is Whitney from NASF. Are those maps or the infographic that you just showed, is that available to me?
Oh yeah, we can get you all this stuff, so it's your project actually. So
great. I'll take those whenever
okay. Yep, we can do that. So the other one is, again, sort of a water theme, but we're moving out of the urban environment and we're moving out to the sort of the landscape. So all of these stories, I was a big advocate that we need to think about like sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we need to be really low on that pyramid in terms of, people's houses burning up, them not having good water, not having clean water. I think if you're going to move the needle in the sort of economic times that we have now and lobbying for funding for state, we need to be thinking like that. And this is a really good one that talks about, where sources of drinking water are. So here's our story. So watersheds with high forest to faucets index. Forest to faucets, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it basically tries to identify watersheds and their importance to surface drinking water sources for, for cities, towns, everything else. So what we want to do is make sure that management plans, forest health projects, all of those things that we do as a whole agency, not just within some water program, but all the things we do collectively, including fuels projects, forest health, et cetera, we want to make sure that we're working in those watersheds that are really important for surface drinking water for humans. So if you look at this map, the darker blue is basically areas that service more drinking water to humans. And what we want to do is we want to say, hey, we're out there doing stew plans, we're doing fuel projects, we're doing forest health treatments, we're preserving land through forest legacy. And we want to make sure that at least one piece of criteria that we're thinking about, it lines up to, it includes the importance of drinking water. And we're still refining this one. So we have a really good SME team. We have a lot of water experts in the country. We have people from the South involved. And, we're still kind of working on this one, and we haven't piloted it completely yet, but you kind of get the idea. The other reason that we like these stories and telling them this way is because a lot of times in the state forestry agencies, they're sort of in this mode of thinking about, I have this forest health program and I have this, fire program. And even within the fire program, I might have like my WUI coordinators and I might have my landscape people. And then, I have my stewardship program, and we're trying to get them to speak about what they do less program by program. And we're trying to spin that on its head and say, let's talk about like the fire problem, and let's talk about the water problem, and let's talk about the value of the things you do, and not get mired down in like the way you've done business for 30 years. Let's try to break that mold a little bit, or 100 years rather. So.
This is Patty Madison. I'm with the Southern Research Station, and we're doing research that'll be, well, we did it for the national forest. It shows in the south exactly where, how much water comes off of each forest and for each town. And now we're doing the same thing for the southern state and private foresters. And that's done by the fall. So I didn't know if you all were aware of that.
No, I can get you hooked up with Mindia, who's been doing most of the work on this project. And The other thing that I didn't mention is we also are looking at like groundwater recharge zones, so we're trying to get that in the mix. I was lobbying a little bit, looking for USGS is doing some cool work with pre and post fire landslide susceptibility measures, and I think that's something we'll probably grow into. But you know, any of those sources of data that we think could be relevant, I can, you know, definitely get you connected up with.
Yeah, we need to definitely get plugged into that, because also we have another model that we're doing, and it's bringing it all in. It's bringing in national forests as well as state and private forests into different groupings. It talks again about water quality and quantity. And then on that, with fire, we also have another model, a recent study that came out that showed how does, you know, the fire after a wildfire, how does that affect, you know, again, water quality and water quantity. And the results were really startling between the West and the South. And the South.
Yeah, that would be good to look at. And you know, ultimately, we would like to be able to tell stories about, like, we've done stuff with ecosystem services and doing like land management around, you know, nutrient runoff and you know, quantity and quality, and those are really nice quantifiable, you know, measures. And they're hard numbers that we can look at, pounds of nitrogen, pounds of phosphorus. You know, we use like GWLF, like general watershed loading function models, and we did all kinds of crazy stuff like you're doing probably. And that's ultimately what we want to mature into, is doing sort of more of that hardcore.
Yeah, and they may be connected, but we need to really make sure that we're connected with everything that's going on.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll get your contact information. I can get it from Brighton or somebody.
Okay. No problem. Here as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was going to take a minute just to show you this thing real quick. So this is another project we've been working on, and so ideally we want to kind of, the thing that we've been preaching to everybody is everybody always worries about, you know, measures, and they worry about measures for a couple different reasons, because people generally hate being measured. But the other thing they worry about is the additional data ask and asking for more data. And the thing that I've really been trying to tell people is, you know, it's not, you know, NASF's or the Forest Service intent to just ask for more data. What I really want to do is get to a position where I'm asking you for less data, but I'm asking you for better data. So I need data in a different way. So we have this thing that's sort of in a pilot mode now called PRISM. And the nice thing about it is, if you can envision behind this map that you're looking at now, which are all the Forest Service regions, and you can envision, you know, hundreds of thousands of little polygons where you as states have done stewardship plans on the ground. And, you know, so what we did is we set it up so that, you know, we don't want to show where every one of those landowner boundaries is, but, you know, we can take all of those things and we can aggregate them, and we can say, okay, well, here's how much work is going on, you know, in these areas in terms of pure, like, the numbers of plans. You know, then we can take it and spin it and say, okay, well, what about, you know, what about the acres of those plans? Then we can say, okay, well, let's not think about it in terms of, you know, the region. I actually care about, like, at a state level, what's going on. So I should have zoomed in somewhere in the West so you don't focus on your state. Let me do that. Everybody's going to be looking at their own state.
That's the West up there. We fuss about it being the West. That's the way it goes.
Yeah. So we can do, you know, we can sum it up this way, you know, then we can go to county, so we can actually go down to the county level and we can show, you know, multiple selections there, congressional districts, you know, so their congressional districts are really big, right? So, and then, you know, even this, right? So, you know, as I zoom in, I get more and more detailed, you know, HUC boundaries, you know, I'm clicking these HUC boundaries. So this is kind of nice in that it, you know, it helps me take like one piece of data and summarize it multiple ways. So it's kind of that prism, right? It's one thing going in, and I'm refracting it into multiple sort of stories, but it gets even better than that. So the other thing I can do is I can turn on the priority land. So all your forest action plans, ideally what you're doing is you're out on the ground and you're defining where you should be working, right? So let me slide this down a little bit. So these are all the forest action plans, these darker areas. And, you know, behind the scenes, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, you know, of the acres of work you did, you know, how well did it line up with your forest action plan? So that's kind of the way we want to do it. And if you can think about this model we did within the world of like stewardship and co-op in forest management, if you think about, okay, what if I were tracking where I'm doing all my fuel treatments and the polygons where I'm doing fuel treatments out on the ground, and how well that's lining up with like the Southern Wildfire Risk Assessment and where I've got a bunch of red pixels. You know, that's something what we would like to do. What about where I'm out there doing all my work in my forest to faucets? So now I drape my forest to faucets data back here. So I want to be able to take sort of, the forest action plans are great because they're sort of an amalgamation of everything, but I also want to be able to tell really pointed stories, meaning like fire story, water story, and the things that make up the forest action plan. And ultimately we want to get to the point where we're asking for better data and less data, and we can use that to power, you know, any story we ever can probably imagine doing, and even start plugging in like deeper models, like, you know, the quantity, quality, you know, runoff models. And, you know, there's not a whole lot of data you need to power those stories. I mean, you need to know kind of what you did and where you did it. And then you can model it out using other things like soil and, you know, elevation models and, you know, all the other sort of input tech. So.
Great, I love that.
Say that again?
That's great, I love that.
Oh, cool. Thank you. The next steps, basically, we've got a bunch of manual calculations. The one measure I didn't show you that we've started on also is tracking where you're doing prescribed burns in the landscape, and, you know, how that relates to where you've got wildfire risk on the landscape. And you know, basically you want to turn red pixels to green, and that was the #1 rated measure actually, is, you know, show me where you've got risk in the landscape and, you know, WUI areas, and prove to me that you're doing prescribed burns and other things that get fuels off of the ground, and then make those red pixels turn to green. Absolutely the #1 voted by all the state foresters, and the #1 that Jim Hubbard liked when he was in office. And he